I'm so excited to welcome you to our Still in Love panel. Still in Love, Multicultural Lesbian Publishing in the 80s, 90s, and Beyond. This panel builds on a fall panel about Naiad Press's lesbian publishing and new oral histories about Naiad Press that are being put together by Florida State University. That panel is available, and Sierra will put the link. A recording of that panel is available, and Sierra will put a link into the chat for that one. This evening, Sinister Wisdom and the Lesbian Herstory Archives are pleased to have you join us for a discussion with the founders and authors of Lute Books and Firebrand Books about their visions of multicultural lesbian and feminist publishing during the 1980s, 1990s, and beyond. I'm going to take a moment and mute everyone and then probably unmute myself because I am hearing some feedback. And in the wisdom of Zoom, we were just talking about the new thing Zoom does. It does not mute me this time. As I said, I'm Julie Enzer, and I'm happy to welcome you here. Before we begin our formal program, we have a tradition of doing a land acknowledgement. All of us gather together around the United States and around the world, many, if not all of us, living on occupied, unceded land. I am in what is now Dover, Florida, traditional homelands and territories of the Seminole. Please insert into the chat your location and acknowledge the land on which you live as we pause for a moment to recognize the histories of war and colonization and to imagine and work for a world where we have a fair and equitable distribution of resources. As always, our Sinister Wisdom program is about an hour long. We will wrap up at the top of the hour. That's 8 p.m. if you're on the East Coast, including time for our traditional dance number at the end. I know that many of you looking at the folks gathered tonight, we have many familiar faces, and I know that you're familiar with and support the work of Sinister Wisdom. But as we settle in for the event, let me just say a few words about Sinister Wisdom. It started as a quarterly journal of lesbian literature and art in 1976, and we've been publishing consistently since then. Our current issue is Sinister Wisdom 127 on transfer. And at this point, I would hold it up, but I will tell you I'm a little addled by a cold today, and I forgot to grab my issues from the desk. So if you are a subscriber, you have that already in the mail. That was our January issue. Our next issue is winging its way to people. Someone was emailing me today saying that she was reading it now. That's Sinister Wisdom 128, Trans Feminisms. We're having our launch for that issue on the third Tuesday in April. Many of you noticed we mucked up the date, so I'm pausing and not saying what it is, but all our events are on Tuesday evening, all at 7 p.m. on the East Coast. It's the Tuesday right around tax day. So if you do your taxes at the last minute, get them done early and join us for the event then. If you're not currently a subscriber, please do sign up for a subscription today by going to sinisterwisdom.org/subscribe. And if you're able, think about becoming a monthly sustainer by making a small gift monthly. All our sustainers receive every month when their gift comes in an email from me with updates, book recommendations, movie recommendations, and other behind-the-scene things happening at the journal. So we now have over 100 sustainers, and I appreciate the many ways that lesbians lift up and support our work at Sinister Wisdom. Our usual housekeeping announcements: keep your microphone muted throughout the program. If we detect noise, we'll mute you, and there will be an opportunity to unmute and ask questions later in the program, and also to wave and cheer when we do our dance number. As our program proceeds, if you want to show appreciation for the readers, wave your hands at the end of the speaking or when you're agreeing with something. Feel free to use the reaction emojis and also light up the chat in Zoom. I will be monitoring that and take questions from the chat also for our speakers this evening. Sierra is on board for technical assistance, so reach out to them if you need help or something's going on weird with your Zoom situation. And we are, as you heard at the top of the hour, recording the event, and we'll make it available starting tomorrow or Thursday at sinisterwisdom.org/SW127, and also on our YouTube channel, which continues to grow with people following it. So this evening, I'm so thrilled for this roundtable discussion about Aunt Lute and Firebrand Books, two independent feminist publishers that together changed all of our collective reading, thinking, learning lives as lesbians and as feminists. As this roundtable proceeds, we will have 4 panelists for the conversation. I will introduce each of them briefly and will put a more complete biography of each person in the chat. And then after about 30 minutes of facilitated roundtable conversation, we will open up the discussion to the audience for comments, questions. Often people testify as well, and you will be invited to do that. Firebrand Books, many of you know, published just over 100 books between 1985 and 2000, including iconic titles. And I will say this list is so incomplete, but I'm still going to make a list here, including iconic titles by Dorothy Allison, Alison Bechdel, Cheryl Clarke, Leslie Feinberg, Jewelle Gomez, Cherríe Moraga, Minnie Bruce Pratt, and many, many others. Aunt Lute similarly has published nearly 100 books, including bringing to us all Gloria Anzaldúa's extraordinary Borderlands, La Frontera. And most significantly and inspiring to me as someone involved with lesbian and feminist publishing, Aunt Lute continues to publish today, bringing new readers to their impressive backlist and catalog, and also publishing important new voices, particularly focused on women of color. Both of these independent publishers emphasized bringing multicultural lesbian voices to readers. And the idea for this roundtable picked up on that discussion that we had at the Naiad roundtable. So to begin our conversation, I want to welcome the 2 principals of these incredible presses, Joan Pinkfoss, who is the founder and current executive director of Aunt Lute Books, and Nancy Bariano, the founder and editor of Firebrand Books until she retired and Firebrand closed in 2000. Nancy and Joan join us from their homes on opposite sides of the country. And we're going to begin with Joan, and each of them are going to tell us a bit about their publishing work. So Joan, will you tell us about your work with Aunt Lute? And Joan, you're muted.
I guess I was going to talk about a little bit of the history and why we got started and how we got started. And just to say, like a lot of other editors, I'm not as articulate in public forums, so just expect that. So be very informal. So Barb Weezer and I co-founded Aunt Lute together in Iowa City in 1982. And I got to Iowa City because I went to the MFA Writers Workshop there to work in fiction at the same time that Joy Harjo was working in poetry, which is kind of fun. But and I would say that there were a lot of lesbians and feminists that wound up in Iowa City at that time because of the university and the activities around it. And so that meant, well, for whatever reason, we had a tremendous coagulation of lesbians in Iowa City and who were very active. And then a lot of lesbians coming from East Coast to West Coast because we were on Interstate 80. And so even before Aunt Lute got started, we had an amazing, there was the Anti-Women Newspaper Collective that was printing there. And then Barb and I had also, with other women, had started a printing press called, oddly enough, the Iowa City Women's Press. And we're connected up with, people like other folks doing the same kind of work. So people like Judy Grahn and Wendy, who were running the Women's Press in Oakland. And in this kind of work then began to be connected with people who were already in publishing. And out of this became this great movement called the Women in Print movement. Thank you. Which became a burgeoning collection of printers, presses, bookstores that would get together and help each other go forward with what we were doing. And at the same time, there was just this burgeoning of creative lesbians who were doing poetry work, writing fiction, doing this wonderful work, and weren't being seen by mainstream at all. So it became clear, as so many other things became obvious, that if this was to be done, it would be done by us. And so as a result, we created all sorts of institutions and media, publishing, printing, distribution, and of course the bookstores helping with the distribution. And I wanted to mention at the time that Barb and I started the Iowa City Women's Press that we actually printed some of Naiad's books, which kind of adds to the scope of that. And we also printed the magazine Common Lives, Lesbian Lives, which is a very important institution, and that I know Julie and her folks are working with them now on a future book. And also want to mention that Carol CJ with her Feminist Bookstore News was a very important part of keeping us all in communication. That was, I think, should be said. So in 1986, Barb had already left to go to Minneapolis and eventually wound up the head of the Amazon bookstore there. So that was great for her. And I moved the press to San Francisco and joined with Spinsters Inc. just for 2.5 years, I think, where Sherry Thomas was doing important lesbian work like Lesbian Sex and Lesbian Passion by Joanne Lulon and other important books. And we got together because we wanted to make a larger impact publicly, especially getting seen by, journalists like Library Journal, Publishers Weekly and stuff. And in fact, that did make a difference. So we did that. But as soon as I got there, I started working with Gloria on her book Borderlands. And as you know, it's a classic. But that work was then published in 1987. And I met Gloria in Iowa City at one of the great national conferences that the Iowa City Women Against Racism put on. I mean, Cherríe also spoke there, right, Cherríe? I think you did, yes. And I met Gloria there, and out of that, we sort of formulated this project that we were going to do together. And she lived in Oakland at the time. So when I got to San Francisco, it was great. We got it done. We got it out in 1987. And at the same time, I was seeing what other publishers like Nancy were seeing, is that almost all the publishing of the women's publishers in the United States, that is, not so much in Canada, were white middle-class women, because, we obviously had maybe the ability to take those risks financially that other people might not take. And that was before Kitchen Table was formed. And I think that, like others, I saw that we had an obligation then to spread out the possibility of voices of women of color who were even less likely to get published, and lesbians of color who were even less likely to get published by mainstream. And then working with Gloria and realizing if she had not been published, how impoverished our literature world would be if Gloria's work had not been published, made me realize that this is the work that I wanted to do. So Spinsters and I split because I formed a nonprofit, because I realized after watching Gloria's book take 3 years to even get to a primary audience, that we had to be a nonprofit and be helped by grantors and private funders, which we still need today. I mean, it's very important for us. And so it gave me the opportunity to think about creating an institution that reflected the very people we wanted to serve. And so that's why we have a very diverse board, and had started with a very diverse staff, diversity in interns. And we're able to be part of that whole thing to make that happen. Let's see, I think the other thing I wanted to talk about a little bit, I think there's one other thing before I do my last 2 points here. Well, mostly just to say that even though I had the idea of how we might get started, it was the hundreds of women who came through there that formed this the very character of Aunt Lute Books. And it was an ongoing development, and it's to their credit that we came out as well as we did, and have been sustained as long as we have. So let me just say that 2 things in looking back that I kind of want to think about is that, first of all, I think what was most important for Aunt Lute was its accessibility. We considered ourselves sort of a grassroots press, and we considered ourselves as just being an instrument where women could access the public with the things that they wanted to say. And that's true. We are still that way today. We see ourselves as facilitators, not owners, just facilitators of what can happen. Big important part of our work is to connect, asking community leaders and facilitators to help us connect our authors with their communities. That is over 50% of the work that we do at Aunt Lute today. And secondly, I think in trying to build this literary culture in a larger sense than just myself, that what we did together with these hundreds of women was to build an even larger community that moved towards social justice. And it was the community that we wanted. And I also have to say that, importantly, our donors, who are angels, were an integral part of that community, because without them, we couldn't have been sustained. And these were people who understood what our mission was and were willing to join with us in partnership to make that mission happen. And then finally, just to thank Julie for kind of continuing this kind of tradition of understanding what community means and how it goes forward hand in hand in a way that Aunt Lute believes in, I think. And not to say that there weren't sacrifices. There's little pay, long hours, the usual story. But and even today, our footing's very precarious. But I say the manuscripts that are coming in are still need to be published. So that's Aunt Lute.
Thank you so much, Joan. I put in the chat that your modesty is overwhelming because you have been involved in so many projects that are over the past 50 years that are just central to how we understand lesbian publishing, feminist publishing, and intellectual communities as well. So thank you, Joan. Now, equally impressive, Nancy, tell us a bit of your story of Firebrand. And you already have some new fans in the chat excited to hear that you're working on a memoir. So take it away, Nancy. Nancy, you're also muted.
How's that? Okay. There are many different feminisms, and one of the ways of illustrating that is to discuss a little bit the difference between the way Joan has organized her life and her feminism practice, okay, as it relates to publishing. I'm sure as it relates to lots of things, but specifically as it relates to publishing, from the way I organize that. I live in Ithaca, New York, 250 miles from New York City, a university town, which means that there are lots of potentially interested people, but no huge population presence of feminists, lesbians. Yes, obviously in the university town and in this particular historical time, there are many out women. And but when Firebrand started, there were not many out women. It was a pretty isolated set of circumstances. And basically, I had never thought about doing any publishing. I worked for Elaine Gill, who owned Crossing Press. And Crossing Press had a feminist series, and entitled By the Owners by John and Elaine Gill. And the feminist series, they hired me, I think because I knew how to deal with commas. I mean, I really don't think that there was a serious intent to bring on board somebody who is going to, rock the boat. And I had my own ideas of what it was that I wanted to do. I was newly out. So all of these books, many of the books that I was publishing were helping to define my life. Certainly in the beginning, that was true. I learned a lot about my sexuality. I was a practicing lesbian. I learned a lot about my sexuality from Joan's work. Okay. And I learned a lot about different kinds of politics from the writings of different people, including people that Aunt Lute published. And it seemed obvious to me that, one, as a white woman, I had real obligations to women of color to make available to them some of the goodies, although they were very minimal, that were available to a press like Firebrand, whose seed money came from 3 different women, one of them my mother. That's a whole other story, which is in the book. Much to my surprise, let's put it that way, much to my surprise. But women who believed in the work that I had already done at Crossing, and then I got fired. And then I said, well, the only thing for me to do, if Elaine is really going to fire me, is to start my own press. And really, that is how Firebrand started. It was not a consensus decision by a group of women. It had nothing to do with anything other than the skills that I had developed at Crossing as the editor of the feminist series. And it very much ran on a parallel track with my world opening up. It turned out I was very good as a publisher, that my work in life as an organizer, which I had done for many years in other non-literary contexts. I had been a welfare rights organizer. I had been involved in all of the things, or many of the things, that time period encouraged people to be involved in. So Vietnam War, housing discrimination, same issues everywhere, The joy about Ithaca, I mean, there are other good things, but the joy about Ithaca is that it's small enough for one to be able to see how the issues play out. Yes, we have homeless people, for example, but because we can see who the homeless people are and we can count them in the quote unquote jungle space that they live in as squatters in that space, there's a way of getting more of a handle on the realities of the lives of people who were disenfranchised, because many of them, not necessarily the homeless folks, but many other kinds of disenfranchised people show up at the supermarket. You know, it's not that big a town. And so you get a real sense of what the issues are, and you're faced with them. If you look, you can ignore it if you choose to. And many people here do ignore it, think that they found nirvana and there's nothing that ever needs any changing, which obviously is not, true, and certainly not what I subscribe to. So Firebrand was very fortunate in that it was a time when lesbian literature was just bursting forth. It hadn't been published widely, even in a hidden kind of way. I'm not talking about big press publishing. Okay, lesbians had not published widely. Many women had manuscripts that they had been working on that were in a drawer someplace. Okay, and so it just exploded. Firebrand had an open submissions policy because I decided that was the way I was going to get to see the stuff that was available. If I made people jump through hoops, then it was to my disadvantage as the owner of the press, as much as was to the disadvantage of the author. So I had an open submissions policy. I figured out how to do that so that I actually could, myself or other people that I worked with, could evaluate things, but everybody got a look. Everybody got a look-see. None of the stuff went on a slush pile waiting to be discovered by somebody else who wasn't me. There was only me in the office and one other person throughout the entire 15 years, different other people, 4 different younger women who were in the office with me, and then worked freelanced out to designers, proofreaders, people with very specific necessary publishing skills. And I preferred that system because I was a better organizer than I was a manager. Managing seemed much more like running a family. And I had enough, I wasn't interested in doing that. I did not want to come up with personnel manuals about when people could go to lunch and how many days. I much preferred that people figured out, there was only one other person in the office, what time do you want to go to lunch? Okay, and please call before blah, blah, blah time in the morning if you know you can't come in, so that I can figure out sort of how to reorganize the day. And that worked for me. And I could understand why it would not necessarily work for other people. So it's not that I was peddling this model. There was no time to peddle anything. I mean, I worked 70-hour weeks, and that was not sufficient to get all of the work done. I mean, there was no couch in the office. That was intentional because I did not want to sleep in the office. I made a promise that I would come home at the end of whatever the length of the day, that I would come home and I would have some other life besides Firebrand, a very limited some other life with a wonderful, several different partners, one of them totally wonderful. But it was new. I was making it up. And the part that wasn't new was the kind of camaraderie that existed amongst the women's presses. And it wasn't a question of saying, oh, my best friend, and they would never do anything that would in any way upset me. But basically, there was no history of robbing books from one another, sort of stealing authors. The presses sorted themselves out in terms of the tone and the kind of books that they were most interested in. And so rarely was somebody trying to operate on somebody else's turf. You know, the most obvious example would be, Naiad made it very clear that they were very willing to be helpful with information about foreign rights, about whatever. Okay, as long as you didn't try to publish the books that they wanted to publish. I mean, that was very explicitly said to me, we'll show you our foreign rights contract so that you can see what a foreign rights contract looks like. All right, but don't ever let us hear, that we are vying for the same author. Now, of course, I got my comeuppance in that one of Firebrand's authors has now been my lover and wife for 28 years. So everybody thought that was sufficient punishment for me having a civil relationship with Barbara and Donna. But in any case, I had an eye for the kind of books that I wanted. About a third of the books were by women of color, ethnic, some ethnic, not defined by everybody as of color. Do you think Italian is an of color? Well, compared to WASP, Italian is of color. So, okay. But in general, I'm talking about books by African-American and other generally accepted as women of color women. Okay. So about a third of the list. And I tried to make that happen. I mean, it was very clear that I wanted that. And I think Joan will agree that once you put you take whatever the risk is, or you make the decision to publish somebody's book and you do well by it. And I'm not talking about selling thousands and thousands of copies, okay? But you do well by it, and that you treat the author well, and you both learn something out of the experience, and it's a generally positive thing that has happened. Well, other authors hear about that. And so when somebody is trying to push their manuscript, they'll say, well, how was your experience with ABC Press? You know, and so you become your own best publicity by virtue of the work that you've done, which is the way it should be. That just seemed very normal. Not everybody, many people, and then I will stop. Many people assume that I came from money because of the way I look and dress. Okay. And I once had an interesting conversation with Cherríe about white girls who insisted upon not dressing well as sort of a mark of rebellion or whatever. That was never me, because I was my mother's daughter and I was taught about dressing well, and I rather liked that. It was very hard living in Ithaca, New York, where dress up meant a clean, ironed shirt. That was it, you know, that you went someplace because you had scrubbed before you got there, as opposed to wearing your work boots, et cetera, et cetera. So very different personalities. And I think it was the strength of women's presses, very different personalities and places that people came from, the kinds of things that had been real influences in people's lives, the owners' lives, the editors' lives, affected the way the press functioned and what the press was interested in. There wasn't enough money. I mean, there was virtually no money. So there wasn't enough money to sort of allow for all kinds of things that you felt uncomfortable with, that you didn't want, because how could you do that when you were the last person paid? Okay, my staff person, although she certainly didn't make a lot of money, I made a little bit more money than she did, very little, and had the same benefits that I had. You know, she had health insurance, she had vacation, she had all of that kind of stuff. And that was it. There wasn't any space to experiment with things that you didn't believe in. If you were going to risk, you had to think that this was important, that be something that you were willing to, I don't want to say do or die over, but come up with some kind of formula that was going to enable you to survive. So, for example, Alison Bechdel, who I first encountered with a single framed cartoon in Woman News, the New York City women's newspaper, okay, which I think came out once a month, but I'm not 100% sure of that. Okay, so I encountered this thing. I was not a cartoon reader particularly, but she slayed me. She absolutely slayed me with her political cartoons because she was so smart and she made me laugh. And so I introduced myself, and eventually, I don't know, she did 9 books for Firebrand before things changed and Firebrand closed. And, you know, she helped support poetry. I could not have done as much poetry as I did if Alison's books hadn't sold as well as they did, because there was not outside money that was going to pay for the poetry. I mean, sometimes, yes, but the books basically had to pay for themselves, and other books had to pay for them if they weren't paying for themselves. And that was a publisher's calculation. You know, those were the business savvy that I brought. And I think that's something, actually, Julie, that you understand. When I look at your work, when I've seen what you've done, it seems to me that you understand that particular way of looking at things from a business point of view. Can we do this even if it's going to only sell blah, 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 because we have that's going to do incredibly well. We believe in it, so we don't feel like we're making a compromise. Okay, but it's the only reason we can publish some of the less popular things.
Yeah.
The less popular things.
And certainly Sinister Wisdom is a hybrid in some ways between what Firebrand did and what Joan did, because
Absolutely.
profit. Yeah.
And one of the
let
me just say one more thing.
Okay.
I just want to say one more thing, which is that I believed then, and I believe now in terms of my non-publishing life, that women of color should inherit the earth, are on their way to inheriting a piece of the earth that we share. Okay, that white women need to step back and make room for women of color to be front and center, not just because it's owed to them. This is my feeling, not just because it's owed to them, which of course it is in terms of equity and all of those kinds of things, but because they have things to say that we don't know as white women. I always find that my books were ahead of me in certain ways, that I learned both about myself and about the larger world, because so many of the women that I published lived different lives and thought about things differently and brought different things to the table. I didn't feel like I was doing people favors. I felt like, well, of course this has to be out there. How could people not want to know?
Right.
This kind of
And so
stuff.
now I want to invite in two authors who published with each of these presses and have both knowledge of the two presses, but also the broader feminist and independent publishing landscape, Cherríe Moraga and Irene Lara Silva. So I'm going to give them slightly longer bios. Cherríe Moraga is an internationally recognized poet, playwright, essayist, and memoirist. She began working as a professional writer as co-editor with Gloria Anzaldúa of the avant-garde feminist anthology, This Bridge Called My Back, Writings by Radical Women of Color, which many people, I'm sure, have read and know about. As a political and literary essayist, she's published several collections of writings, and we have a complete biography, including her titles, in the chat. Irene Lara Silva is the author of 4 poetry collections, Furia, Blood Sugar Canto, House of Song, and First Poems, as well as 2 chapbooks and the short story collection Flesh to Bone. She and the poet Dan Vera are also co-editors of Iman, Poets Writing in the Anzaldúan Borderlands, which is a collection of poetry and essays published by Aunt Lute. And a more complete biography of Irene's is in the chat as well. So Cherríe, will you start us off by sharing your reflections on publishing with independent feminist presses?
Yes. Hello, everyone. There's quite a collection of folks out there. Some people I imagine I haven't seen like in 40 years, maybe longer. So thanks for showing up. It's good to be here. It's good to be in such good company with the featured writers here. I'm particularly happy that Irene is here and to share the virtual space with you, my sister, my younger sister. And I'm great admirers, of course, of Joan's work and Nancy's work, and learning more of your work, truly. So thank you so much for the opportunity. Oh my God, I was writing down all kinds of notes and I was remembering things, but I think what I want to say is maybe take up where I do want to talk about my experience working with Nancy. And she's still styling, you can see that. I mean, that's not an issue, right? So it's like, I don't remember saying that to you, but I knew that I always thought you styled really well. You know, I was an admirer. So anyway, you still got it. So I think what I want to pick up with where she left off in terms of women of color. I was really fortunate, and also sort of the way publishing kind of came in with, for me, with my queerness, but also with women of color feminism. I was really fortunate to move to the Bay Area from LA in 1977. And that world was, it was a great place on one level to be a lesbian. And since that was the most pressing concern for me at that point in my life, I landed in a good place. But also what I landed in a good place also as an emergent writer, and to be surrounded by the knowledge, like to be able to meet Judy Grahn and Pat Parker, and to be surrounded by, the women's bookstore there, Naiad Press, all of that. It was like, it was missing around, with some exceptions, notably Pat Parker's work. It was missing it was very class conscious. A lot of, the Women's Union had been there and all this stuff, really a lot of class conscious. But the race stuff was, from a feminist perspective, was still to a certain degree emergent, or we are looking to specifically to the writings of Black women in the 70s. Mm-hmm. That body of work changed our lives as women of color feminists. So, and I just feel like I've just been really blessed because of Bridge. By virtue of Bridge came out in 1981, but Gloria and I started working on it, and I think the first note out to people about trying to get people to contribute to Bridge was as early as 1977. Wow. That means I was 1978. So I was like 26 years old, and Gloria's 10 years older than me. So we had this really great. And I have to remember this, and I want to keep saying this. It was two Chicana lesbians that co-edited that book, and I always feel really impassioned about that because nobody talks about that. Nobody talks about the two virtually unknown, unpublished Chicana lesbians edited that book. So I think the specificity, when we're talking about women of color, remains a very important point, right? The specificity. So, so Gloria and I don't know, we thought we could do this, but then I have to thank my Black sisters, because it was because of Audre Lorde, and it was because of Toni K. Bambara, and it was because of Barbara Smith and Combahee River Collective and their willingness to be in a book with us that made the book visible, right? Because we understand race is largely understood in this country as Black-white. So those sisters, the Black lesbian sisters, Toni K., I'm not saying she's lesbian, but all these sisters, hardcore feminists, showed up, Pat Parker, and the book certainly came to fruition and has had the impact this has. I do have to say it was the racism of white women right after Bridge came out in 1981, it came out with Persephone Press, and it was their racism that had us move. The press was falling apart, but also in the process of trying to get the book back, it was a really, really horrible barracuda, lawyer type thing. And so we got the book back, and I'm really grateful in retrospect that they did that, because that founded Women of Color Press. That was the first book we were going to do. And the second book was Homegirls, Black Feminist Anthology. So the collection of women of color that came together, first in Boston and then in New York, to do a Women of Color Press, it was like, if you ever got the message about owning the means of production, potentially losing, this Bridge Called My Back after this huge, they were great. They were really great publishers. That book sold like crazy. In the first, I think it said sold 10,000 copies in the first 4 weeks. So we're going, yay. And the next thing we know, it's not yours. It's not yours. And so if it's not ours, we don't got it. And I think, of course, and I honor how much, so much has changed. Of course, so much has changed. And you're looking at two really exemplary, models of publishers in which that is the case. And that has been the case, and it is the case. So, all honor to you, my sisters. But it's like, it remains. And then the other part that I want to talk about is, as a writer, what it was in the 1980s. So there's Women of Color Press. It's just beginning to happen. but we were hanging with each other. In other words, those writers, Jewelle Gomez, Cheryl Clarke, Dorothy Allison, I mean, that's who we were hanging with, Barbara Smith. And I say that because I remember in the Women Who Hate Me, right? The Women Who Hate Me is Dorothy's book. And I remember meeting with her and I'm helping her edit it. We're talking about it. And then Audre Lorde's doing Zombie. I remember with Barbara and me helping her edit it. It's like we were working together. We were working together. So there was that movement in the early 80s in New York City, you know, with all of these sisters, you know, and there some of whom were part of Multicultural Press, but it was just kind of the world, you know, that we were. It was, I don't know how, you know, for me, I'm from LA, Chicana, I don't know how I got so damn lucky, you know. But what I realized is that they set a standard, particularly those women of color feminists, particularly Black feminists, set a standard about what it meant to be, before intersectionality was ever a word, what it meant to really be, you know, that you had to think more than one thing in your head at the same time. And that it was as important the specificity of your identity, you know, as the sites in which you also coalesce with each other. So the other part of it is that one of the key moments I remember, though, about lesbian publishing, women feminist publishing, was the Women in Print conference in 1981. And this cracks me up because, so we come in, there's a really wonderful picture of all the women of color contingent, and Audrey was there, and, you know, Juanita Ramos, who did the lesbian collection of Latino lesbians, and Gloria was there, all these folks, and Barbara and Beverly Smith, a bunch of people. And but we were like this little core group in a sea of white feminists, many of whom were lesbians. And, you know, as they say, some of my best friends were there, right? I remember the Women of Feminary, you know, hardcore activist sisters, man. They were like practicing what they preached. It is amazing how you can have coalition when people act in the world. They act in the world. And they were poets, literary people who love the arts, you know. And so in that period of time was really, really important. But then the Women Print Conference, the thing that cracked me up, I guess it was just that Adrienne Rich had just gotten Sinister Wisdom. She became the publisher of Sinister Wisdom, or the editors of it, and her and Michelle Cliff. And so Adrienne Rich gets up, you know, and Adrienne had money, right? It's a good name, Adrienne Rich. Adrienne had money, you know. But she gets up and she has this bag, and it's like all the women are there, like all the women, you know, overwhelmingly white women in this big auditorium in DC. And she gets this bag up or whatever, and she says, okay, all of you, you know, say you care about women of color and da-da-da. She says, I'm passing the hat, I'm passing the bag. And we made thousands of dollars in that one sitting. And that was enough to get us going, just enough to get us going, you know. And so it was a really, you know, very, very exciting time. And, you know, Bridges had, you know, lots of time in which it's, you know, it was doing well for a while, went out of print. That's a long story. And after Kitchen Table Press, it went with Third Woman Press, which is a press out at that time, a press out of Berkeley. And illness, different things happen, you know, so then the book went out of print again. I mean, the book has gone in and out. It's been like a journey, and it has been an easy journey to keep it in print, to keep those contributors kind of coalesced with it, to witness every time you go to get it printed again, somebody else has died of the contributors, and to notice who dies first, overwhelmingly, and what that has to do with race and class. So I'm grateful for that journey too, Ultimately, we published at a university press, SUNY press, and that has been the most consistent that the book has had. And largely it's because we finally also made the decision, you know, like we were just really trying to keep it in a woman of color press. And women of color, it's really true. What everybody was saying about how much there is to learn, and the visionary and incredible writing, it's not even a question. But institutional, you already all know this, you know, structural racism, structural classism, all that doesn't make for easy, you know, self-publishing, or not even just self-publishing, but to build, you know, publishing houses. So this has been really consistent for us. It's also been able to, for the contributors, been able to give them consistent, you know, their royalties when royalties come in, et cetera. And so that has been a good fix. So what I wanted to say now personally was that of working with Nancy and Firebrand. She's a wonderful editor. And one of the things that impressed me the most, I had, this is the new version, by the way. And this came out of, this is Waiting in the Wings that she published in 1997. And it came out of, it's a memoir, basically the subtitle is Portrait of a Queer Motherhood. And basically, when my son was born, and this was way before many lesbians were having babies, right? This was all news. So when my son was born, he was born very premature and he almost died. And there was like a 3.5 month period in which I didn't know if he was going to live or die. And he was born tiny, 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 like 2.5 pounds. So I had written this. I didn't plan to write it, but when I was keeping these journal entries, and I had all these journal entries, I realized, oh my God, you know, could be a book. And the great thing I loved about Nancy, and I remain grateful for it. And my son, by the time I get it to her and I have all this, he's almost 3 years old, because I had to recover from all the susto, the fear of losing him. He's survived well. And she says, well, now you have to bring it up to date. So she was saying it wasn't enough just to say, I had to say then what happened for the next 2 years, you know, like the next 3 years. I'm going, what? It was like, but it was a really, really wonderful advice that she gave me to make. It was the first time I wrote a memoir and that long of a work. And she was an incredible guide for me in it. And I thought it had a great literary sense and really helped me rise to the occasion, and also let me stay a poet in writing prose, which I'm very grateful for. And I know that, you know, Joan does the same thing, you know, particularly when we're looking at it in his work. So let me see if I missed any. I took notes so I would remember to say. So I think, you know, partly to, you know, kitchen, then this is the other thing I want to say is that Kitchen Table Press didn't last very long. It was just under 5 years. And then Barbara took the press up to, out of New York City, and then she took it up to Albany, and it published up there as well. But that initial collective of women of color who did Kitchen Table Press was really, you know, a very historical moment. And what I realized is that you also have to know when to stop, right? And that's why I'm really admiring the length of these two, you know, my two sisters here, publisher sisters here, for the length of their commitment. In Joan's case, it's ongoing, but also Nancy knowing when to stop. It's like, and now I know, like I'm doing we have this thing that I'm working with my partner called Las Maestras for Chicana Indigenous Thought, Art, and Social Practice. It is a center that we're doing out of UC Santa Barbara. And I'm, you know, I turned 70 this year. I'm tired. And also the writer has these two agendas all the time, which is also to be writing, right? But partly what you have to know is that you have to know when to stop. And so, and I haven't been doing this long. This last project is like, this is our 6th year, but I'm ready to stop. And maybe I can pass it on. But if you can't pass it on, it matters that you did it. And so that's what I realized about Women of Color Press. I'm going, this was just a little while, it wasn't that long, but it mattered that we did it because it mattered not only, in general, but it mattered to women of color. It mattered that we could do it and so it's history. And so I like this conversation, I like this presentation because really what we're doing is that, all of this history is what brought people to this point in time. So even in this book and Waiting in the Wings, now it got republished this year because it's all these anniversary years, 40 years for Bridge, 25 years for Waiting in the Wings, another 40 years for Loving the Warriors, like that. I've been writing a lot of intros. But the thing is that what's great, what was interesting to me about looking at Waiting in the Wings now is I had to, which I've had to do with all the other works, is how our understanding of ourselves as queer people has changed. Mm-hmm. And if you're writing to a new generation of people, and it's even hard sometimes just to say woman without wondering, what is the context in which you're saying women, and at the same time being aware, and aware is not the right word, that you have to be conscious of how things are being read at multiple levels now that they weren't for us then. And at the same time, trying to say true to something that's true, right? And that's the dance. That's the beautiful literary dance, right? And so what I've enjoyed about doing this new version is I've had to do my little footnotes, right? Yes, but. Like saying that when my son was born a boy, and I'm going, he's a boy, that would be challenged now. Did it matter he was a boy or a girl? And I'm writing, yes, it mattered because I had to raise a boy. I thought it was going to be a girl, and I'm so glad he was a boy. But I'm saying, what does it matter? So the questions are there. So all I'm saying is that us as queer people, young people, and also because being a lesbian mother ain't that big of a deal now, and, or being a lesbian parent is not that big of a deal now. It really was then. And yet homophobia, lesbian phobia, transphobia, all that stuff is alive and well. We all know it, right? So these books still matter. So that's the point. This is the beautiful and horror that they matter so much. Bridge is still like, I teaching my students, it's like the first time I ever taught it, because I never would teach Bridge. I don't know why, but I did last year. And they're saying they can flow with their mouth with intersectionality. Intersectionality this, intersectionality that. They don't know what it means. So our job as poets, as artists, and as publishers who publish those poets and artists, right, is to show them in the flesh what it means. Theory in the flesh.
And so I want to invite Cherríe to share some reflections and ask the audience for a little forbearance as we go over the top of the hour. But Cherríe is also has lovely information to share with us. So Cherríe, please.
So to start, I am so honored to be part of this panel. And Julie, I'm warning you now, you're going to have to shut me down because I've got like 5,000 things I want to say. I tore up my notes and I was like, all right, I'm going to do this. And I'm trying really, really hard to not like spontaneously combust from fangirling or fan personing right now. So where do I start? First of all, Nancy, I'm so glad that you're in Ithaca right now. I graduated from high school in '93 in South Texas in Edinburgh, 10 miles away from where Anzaldúa grew up. I never read any work by a Latina, Latinx period, or lesbian until I went to Ithaca. I survived as an engineering major for 6 weeks because one of my professors gave me a copy of this bridge called My Back. So by October, I had already left engineering, as soon as I got there first semester. And I mean, I read everything in Ithaca. I read Dorothy Allison for the first time. I read Cherríe's work for the first time. I read Anzaldúa's work for the first time. I read half of, Aunt Lute's list and Firebrand Books, and it exploded everything for me. I don't even know who I would be as a person, a writer, without thinking of how the tremendous impact that it had on me to find all of that literature when I was 18. I didn't end up graduating from Cornell, but but that I don't even know how I remember going to class. I remember reading. I remember tons and tons of books. But one of the things that I did want to make sure that I said, and I was thinking about this after we had our prep Zoom conversation the other day, was that I think nowadays a lot of writers think or assume that since we're seeing more publication of BIPOC writers and queer writers and feminist writers by the big presses, that then means that the small indie presses are no longer valuable, or that they are, they are important for the work that they historically did. And they're not so much thinking about what they're doing now. My first short story collection was published by Aunt Lute in 2010. And it was interesting how that ended up happening. I thought it would be a natural to be published by a Latinx press or a Latinx imprint at a university press. But it was so crazy to me that, I have notebooks full of all of my rejections from those first years. And I remember there was a Latinx imprint at a university press that said they did not want Flesh to Bone because nobody would ever read it at the beach. There was and I was like, I didn't know that was a priority for a university press. There was another publisher that told me, I'm not even gonna tell you who these people were, but that told me that they couldn't publish my book because they thought it might do well and they wouldn't know how to handle it. Insane, crazy responses. Or and there was another press, there was a reviewer that read it and said, oh no, she just needs to write another book, and completely dismissed the entire thing. Thankfully, I am very, very stubborn. And I was very, very stubborn about wanting to write the way I wrote and to write the stories that I wrote, because I felt they were necessary, and it was necessary for them to be done a certain way. And it wasn't until many, many rejections and until I worked up the guts to contact Joan and to even contemplate like having the guts to submit a work to Aunt Lute. And it was, for me, it took us a while, but it was amazing. The book's been out for 10 years. In the entire 10 years, I have never come across a typo, an awkward phrase, or anything that I don't absolutely love about the collection. Because Joan and everyone at Aunt Lute took such good care of me and took such good care of the manuscript and respected the story so well. And I think that's one of the things that we're in danger of losing, because we think that the big presses are open to queer and BIPOC and feminist writers. We don't necessarily think about the fact that their main interest is, and they assume that all writers' interest is fame and money. And they don't think about the other possible reasons that a writer might want to write or might want to publish. And I was at one of these, agents and editors conference a few years back. And just for the fun of it, I decided to ask this panel of agents, what if as a writer, my interest is in creating community, of having my work taught, of putting people together, to think of all the books that I read that shaped me, that saved my life, that gave me a refuge. What if I want to contribute to that? And the agent on the panel just looked at me and said, well, don't send your work to me. And that was pretty much the spirit of all of that. And so we have to think about that. Who's getting published? What is the marketplace seeing as what's marketable? How many of us want to write because we want to build and sustain community? How many of us are writing things that are going to be different, either because the style is different, because the function of it is different? I'm having a big problem right now with a lot of writers that, as much as I may love the fact that they are BIPOC women, some queer as well, because we got caught on this idea, I think, of the importance of representation and only representation. And the thing is, I think that we've forgotten that writing is for something. It's not there to model helplessness and voicelessness and powerlessness. I want to model power and transformation and healing and learning and community, all these other different things that the marketplace doesn't assign a monetary value to. And that's one of the fundamental reasons that it is so important to support the presses that are doing the work now and the presses that are going to come, and the writers that are going to do the new work and the presses that are going to do the new work, because what the bell hooks phrase, we think about the marketplace, but we lose the specificity of thinking about what white supremacist capitalist patriarchy supports and what it doesn't. And we can't give up this power that we have, this resource that we have, this history that we have, of publishing other voices and other stories that are deeply tied to a purpose and to a community. And yes, all right, that's what I wanted to say. Go, Julie.
That's
Great.
Cherríe, that's beautiful. As everyone just, we'll make sure to share the chat with all of our speakers. People are loving everything that everyone is saying, so appreciating this panel. As everyone can tell, we could go on all night, but it is Zoom, and I do not want to risk our Zoom fatigue. So thank you all for coming. Thank you so much to Joan and Nancy and Cherríe and Irene for sharing these incredible thoughts and reminding us of the importance and the ongoing significance of this work that we are doing. We will have the video for this up tomorrow. Remember, in three weeks, we have our launch event for Sinister Wisdom 128. And now Sierra is going to share our final song, The L Word, by songwriter Carol Kramer, performed by Your Girlfriend and produced by Esther Records. As you listen to the music, you are welcome to stand up. We will highlight videos of people dancing. And when the music ends, I will end the Zoom call. Continue to put comments in the chat. And thank you so much for joining us this evening. Go ahead, Sierra.
Take a turn.
Thank you all. We'll see you at the next Sinister Wisdom event. Have a great evening.
Wouldn't miss it. Wouldn't miss it.
Thank you.